There's a lot of room, and these screens are not easy to see, so please feel free to, there's no Gallagher part of this talk, there's no exploding watermelon. However, if you do want to follow along on your device, and I kind of apologize for the format of my slides, but it's formatted to look at on your phone, and so if you just want to look at your phone the whole time instead of looking at me, that's fine. You can just go to that address and listen to what I have to say today. And I was also a little bit concerned with the title of this talk until I saw Ali quoted scripture that uses this funny word, whither. And so the title of this talk is information, or I think it's architecture and design, whither the difference. And not everybody knows that archaic term. It sounds like wither, and I didn't want that sense to come across. And perhaps there is a little bit of fatigue in the world with people wringing their hands about what you call disciplines and whose job is it to do what. So it's not about the withering effect of I'm an architect or you're a designer and whose territory is whose, but the archaic sense of whither with an H, which is in what direction are we going? And that is something that I'm really interested in, and it's had a pretty big effect on my life. When I started out as an information architect back in the late 90s, there was not a whole lot of interest in connecting that to what's going on in architecture in the built environment. And now with the advent of things like self-driving cars and artificial intelligence and blended reality, AR, VR, the architecture thing is starting to come back into focus. And so whither the difference between architecture and design, and whither the difference between user experience design and information architecture, I thought it was interesting to start out with a look at, and this is a slide from Google Trends, architecture and design as search terms over time. We can see that there is a different level of interest in these things, and it seems to have leveled out a bit. There's a gap in the interest level, but these two things seem to be on, let's call them parallel paths, and maybe they're never going to touch out into the future. If we do the same analysis for user experience design, or UX design is the search term that I chose, and information architecture, something very different is going on. And this is the motivating force underneath the work that I do, is at about the time when the X starts to happen on that graph. I was a mid-level practitioner. I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years maybe, and this sense that information architecture was about to be subsumed by, eclipsed by interest in user experience design. And that has proven out. You can watch the rest of the lines on the graph to see what they do. And so in what direction are these things going? Where with architecture and design in the built environment, there seems to be a stable relationship. They're not the same thing, and maybe they're not going to touch. This is a little bit more worrisome to me, which is a pattern that looks like they're going to get further away from each other as time goes on. And so as soon as that trend started to become apparent to me, and given the love for information architecture that I've developed, I wanted to dig into that. I wanted to understand that trend and how to do something about it. And in the course of that, it became important for me to get to know the history of my field. And so pretty quickly, if you're interested in information architecture, you start to learn about its roots in architecture in the built environment, and that it was something that came out of the work of the guy who invented the TED conference. This guy's name is Richard Saul Wurman, and over the course of 8 or 9 years or so, I have become his biographer. He is comfortable with me that I have done enough work to understand his work, to talk about it, and every so often he will send me a correction or two. But I've done a lot of work to figure out what makes information architecture from arguably the source, which is this wonderful man who now lives in Florida, Richard Wurman. And as an information architect who was working on screens, websites mostly, I could see why the fact that this guy did 20 conferences or more, it's hard to count his attainments, and 90 or more books, it was pretty easy to make the analogies between these books and conferences are successful. He seems to be able to keep doing them. People seem to like them. And when you look at the work, it makes a whole lot of sense. He's made a whole career out of understanding. And so making that analogical leap was not all that hard, and many of my friends who are interested in visual design and graphic design say, yeah, he's a graphic designer, so what? And so it really wasn't until I dug into and did the research into his history. Nobody really talks about this because nobody has had the interest to go look at some of these buildings, but as an architect, from 1962, I think, is when he got his architectural license, up until 1976. He was involved in all kinds of projects in the built environment. And I think it is his work as an architect that is the most interesting, and that might have some of the keys that I think are important, that I'd love to turn you on to if you don't know about these already, to addressing that. Where are architecture and design going? Clearly we need both. How do we make them come back, if not to touch at some point, at least to not be going in opposite directions? And so I think getting into the architecture part of information architecture is a way to do that. For people who are interested in his definition of information architecture, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time wringing his hands with definitions, but here's something he said about it that had a pretty interesting impact on me. Information architecture isn't just graphics. It's about how to choose the right way to present information and how to help people navigate through it. It's a way of thinking. It's how you go about something in which the aim is not to make something look good, but to make it be good. And as I got to know more about his work as an architect, and as the protege of Lou Kahn, this is a picture of 26-year-old Richard Werman as a architecture teacher at the University of North Carolina, Louis Kahn receiving his first honorary degree from an American university. I came to understand that everything that Richard does as an information architect flows from what he learned about being an architect from his mentor, Lou Kahn. And if we go back to this definition of information architecture, I've been able to visit many of Lou Kahn's buildings. I've been able to visit one of the few standing buildings that Richard built. And I think you could say the same thing of his attitude, and by extension, Lou Kahn's attitude towards architecture. To just say, a building isn't just what it looks like. It's about how to choose the right way to present that series of spaces to people so it makes sense, so they know what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go. And that the way that it looks isn't where the heart of this is. It's in making something in its essence, down to the material, to make things be good. And so the more I dug into this, the more I studied the work of Lou Kahn, the more I understood Richard's work. And especially the very peculiar thing about Richard's sense of the difference between architecture and design. And it comes from, this is a diagram of Lou Kahn's thinking about architecture and design from 1973. And his handwriting is not all that easy to read. You can look at the slides later if you want to examine this. But I think the interesting part about this diagram is most of the action is happening, if this were an iceberg, and design is the thing that's poking up above the surface of the water, so much of what is important to this way of thinking about doing work is below the surface. And so much of it is interior, in the person of the architect or of the designer. And that model is something that very few of the fans of Lou Kahn ever took to heart. Louis Kahn has been put on a pedestal. He's referred to as the architect's architect. He's probably the finest architect that the United States has produced so far, including Frank Lloyd Wright. And I think one of the functions of pedestals is so that we don't have to actually do what these people say. Lou Kahn is far safer up on a pedestal than he is as somebody that you would listen to try to figure out what this means. That design would be up in the realm of the measurable, but there's all this other stuff philosophical stuff that's in the realm of architecture. So he's been safely put on a pedestal. Most of his followers were quite happy to continue on in the tradition of what later became to be called postmodernism. But it's based on modernism. That diagram at the bottom kind of looks like a parking garage, maybe. It's called a Domino Plan. It was designed by the French architect Le Corbusier. And this idea about architecture was, rather than trying to make spaces out of the building, let's make the building as mutable as possible. Let's change the idea of architecture to, instead of making spaces out of material, that we would make very generic spaces. And instead of focusing on the intervention that we are going to do, being an intervention into space, this is saying, you know what? And the diagram from the top is from one of Lou Kahn's students, Robert Venturi. He and his wife, Denise Scott Brown, did a really controversial study of Las Vegas and said, Las Vegas has got it right, you guys. They have these sheds. They call them decorated sheds. They have just a building with a sign on the front. And if the business that's in that building, if whatever you're trying to do in there doesn't work, okay, put a new sign on the front. So it's changing the idea of where is the intervention going to take place. It's a retreat from saying that space and structure is where we intervene. And it's shifting that to say it's the surfaces, it's the signage, it's the part above the water that we'll focus on. And that ends up being, at least to this way of seeing, a shift from architecture as a spatial practice into a shift as designers of surfaces, and being a little bit cowardly when it comes to committing to shaping the building to have a specific purpose. They wanted to keep it generic. And this is also at a time, I pulled this advertising from Progressive Architecture from May of 1976. This is at a time when products are being offered to owners of building projects at an unprecedented scale. So with this tensile structure that you can just buy out of a magazine, the promise here is you can turn a shopping mall into a cathedral through the use of bringing products into that space, and by focusing not on how is the structure of the space set up, but how are we going to populate it with products and experiences, that is the place to be focusing our efforts. And it couldn't be more different than what Lou Kahn was talking about, which is that the meaning you are trying to realize, that what you do as an architect is you encode that in structure. The split image here on the top is a picture of a vacation house that Richard Saul Wurman built on Long Beach Island. There were 4 of these. They were called sand castles, and in the nature of sand castles, 4 of them have gone away. There's one of them that still stands that I was able to visit. And at the bottom is the capital of Bangladesh. Strange structures that are supremely tuned to what the client's world and the client's meaning is. The National Assembly building in Bangladesh is one of the few civil institutional works of architecture that includes a mosque in the structure of the assembly hall itself. In 1976, Richard Saul Wurman was made the chairman of the National Conference at the American Institute of Architects, biggest annual gathering for architects in the United States. And I suspect that this was another, much like putting Lou Kahn on a pedestal made it so that we didn't have to listen to what he says. I think this act of making Richard the chairman in 1976 may have been because they didn't want him on the floor of the conference screwing things up. In 1972, he was the chairman of the International Design Conference at Aspen. And in my research, I've talked to people who attended that conference, and they said that was a call to arms against the institutions of architecture in the United States, a call to changing education for architects, to change the direction that architecture was going in. So perhaps by making him chairman, they thought it would be a less threatening place to put him. And I have not talked to anybody who went to that conference in 1976 who would say that it had any difference on the practice of architecture in its time. In fact, Richard Saul Wurman closed his architecture practice a few months after chairing arguably his profession's, one of the highest honors in his profession. He quit architecture in the built environment for all intents and purposes just a few months later. And instead of a keynote address at this conference, he decided to have a illustrated keynote fable and the reading of a fable. And this fable was called What If Could Be, a historical fable of the future. And I don't think it was meant to teach the people in the room something that they would go home with. I think this is a lot like Jesus' use of parables, a story that has something going on with it that needs more time to diffuse, to have its full effect. And so the delivery of a keynote fable, I suspect this was an awfully strange conference to go to. And the main character of the fable is a little guy called the Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination. A little fat guy with a beard who goes around telling people what they didn't want to hear. Clearly, this is Richard Saul Wurman appearing in his own fable. And what the Commissioner of Curiosity and Imagination did, he was walking around in the city, and the city was called What If. And the fable said that the city of What If in the land of Could Be was celebrating its 200th birthday as a city, which is a thinly veiled fiction for Philadelphia in 1976, the 200th anniversary of Philadelphia and the United States. So the Commissioner of Curiosity is in this fictional land, and they're celebrating their 200th birthday, and he's walking around asking people about what's going on here. And he talks with police officers, and he says, what's going on in the city with what you guys do? And they said, well, crime is terrible. And he asked them what they thought should be done about it, and they said, oh, clearly we need more policemen, more police cars, more jail cells, more nightsticks, more. And he talked with teachers, and he said, how about education here in the city? Are the kids learning, or is this working? Oh, no, the education is terrible. So then what he asked the teachers, what would they do? And they said, well, we need more teachers, more classrooms, more pencils, more erasers, more. And everywhere that he went, when he asked people about what was going on, they could talk about problems. They didn't have a lot of language for solutions. They could talk about problems, and the way they talked about it was in terms of a product, something that they already knew. And there's something that Wurman has said time and again, which is quite uncomfortable. It reminds me of something that the commissioner would have said. The type is kind of small, ready to hear. The classic pervasive seduction to designers has been to find a solution instead of the truth. And I think this is the wisdom of the parable that the people in the room maybe were not ready to hear. And I'm not sure, and I'll put myself in one of those empty chairs, I'm not sure as people in this room that this is something that we are ready to hear. That our mania for problem solving may be at odds with asking about the truth. Over to the right here is another one of those weird diagrams that Kahn made to explain his stuff. And on the left is an excerpt from a book that Richard did. It's a special issue of Design Quarterly from 1989 that's called Hats. And in this thing that he did on the left there, he talks about the difference between what and how. I'll read it off of this one. What and how are important in almost anything. I try to think about what is to be done rather than how to do it. It's important to consciously state, no, that's a how, not a what. Think of what it is and not how you're going to do it. And that difference is not comfortable for many of us. And again, if we look at diagrammatically, based on the work of Kahn, all of that stuff about the what, and then at the end, the little part that pokes up above the surface, when it gets time to design, that's when you're talking about how you will do it from this point of view. In Greek mythology, there is the tragedy of Cassandra, that she knew the fate of other people, and she could tell them about it, but they wouldn't listen. And I think Richard, in 1976, and still today, I had a nice conversation with him at breakfast this morning, is a Cassandra. And this idea of putting what before how is countercultural and not something that we want to hear. a sampling of Google Images. That's how I like to figure out what's going on in any domain. Look through Google Images, not Google text. And if you look at things like design as a search term, every framing of design is in terms of problem solving. And that is, I think, the uncomfortable message that Richard would have for us, and I'll show you 3 ways to get uncomfortable with this, is to not always be problem solving, which is hard to hear, but problem solving is the way that they do things at Google. I teach at the University of Michigan. I have lots of students that end up at Google and Facebook. That's what they're sending those kids in to do, is solve their problems, like the engagement problem of YouTube. And the way that that problem gets solved is surfacing the most contentious kinds of content that will make you upset, that will cause you to have enmity with your fellow beings. That's how YouTube solves their engagement problem. There's people who invented Facebook who now very much regret that. And when you talk about why is Facebook so terrible for us, many of them will go back to, well, it started out as a way to solve the problem that Zuckerberg and his friends had, which is how do we find the best and cutest girls at Harvard? The structure, the way Facebook was put together, its problem that it is still solving is how to find more and better girlfriends at an elite school in the United States. Some of you may know the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. This beguilement with technology and using it as a means, not focusing on it as an end. I think that is part of this difference between, I don't know if it's a difference between architecture and design. It's probably more productive because we don't want to cause divisions between ourselves. Maybe it's better to talk about it just in terms of the action of the verbs. That there is a mode of architecting, there's a mode of designing, and my gosh, what do we leave behind when we leap immediately into the mode of problem solving, into this mode of designing? I think it is part of why we can't have nice things, is this designing and architecting, not talking to each other, not being integrated, because we want both sides of these continuums. We want both of these things, and I think today, the way that we work, starting from how, we only get one side of this picture. And if we look at how Kahn worked, there's a marvelous film by his son Nathaniel. It has footage of him at the bottom. That's a screenshot from the film. It's called My Architect. There's footage of the finishing up of the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, which is his best building. And there's footage of the engineers with their arms crossed. Like, what is he still doing here? One of them even says, this is terrible. Kind of like a wife. He has an idea, but at the wrong time. The engineers at this job in 1972 wanted a separation between architecture and design. He's the architect, he figured some stuff out, he goes away. It's not time for him to be raising the questions about how, but he was always there with his hard hat. And Richard, as a student of his, always involved in the production of the work, never giving a handoff to somebody else to do the how. So this is a call to integrate, not a call to pick sides, as far as I'm concerned. So how do we do this? Let's make the assumption that we all have lots of access to the design side of things. Here are 3 things, 3 little tips from the architecting side of things. Go backward from the problem. I was delighted to hear Jeff Isom bring this up as a potential this morning in his keynote, that if we want to embrace change, maybe that change is not what we want, which is going backward in order to go forward. Establishing the truth about the forces in the environment, and then lastly, using models and diagrams a little bit differently than we might in design. So going backward from the problem, this is one of my favorite stories about the power of information architecture, the power of not just solving the problem. It's a picture of my friends Matt and Jules in the United Kingdom. They had an NGO client in Northern Europe who was trying to address the problem of human trafficking, especially for domestic workers from Southeast Asian countries like Thailand. And so the project that they got hired for was design an app for a domestic worker from Southeast Asia to use to help break the cycle of violence and trafficking. And through their work with this client, what they ended up making is a native language soap opera that runs on YouTube. Because they focused, as information architects do, as Richard and Lou taught us, on the what. The part that pokes above, the part of the iceberg that pokes above the water, that's great. And the client saw one thing poking above the water, which is an app. And by working through all of the reasons why the how had limitations to it, they went backward from the problem, came up with an entirely different solution, and actually talked themselves out of some work. There were some wireframes and some mock-ups they could do of an app. This whole project had to shift to a creative group who can make a soap opera in Thai. But it did the right thing. Secondly, some of you in this room have been participant in this process with my colleagues, establishing the truth about the forces in the environment. Up in Michigan, the roofs of our houses look like this. Because what's true in the environment is that there's going to be a lot of heavy, wet snow, many, many times. Similarly, the truth about the environment where projects like everything that we work on happens, there's a stakeholder environment. There is a climatological system in the intent of the stakeholders and the participants in a project. Before starting to solve that problem, we spend time and we ask our wonderful clients to spend money to go backward from the problem to document what are the forces in the environment. How prepared are you to make a decision about something? And even if you have a decision, like we're going to do an app that does X, Y, and Z, we still insist on going backward to say, now how did you get there? How well are you deciding? How much intention, alignment do you have? And then lastly, in this kind of architecting work, it doesn't obviate the use of the other kinds of models and prototypes. And this is something that architects in the built environment do very little of today because they have CAD and other computer things. But it used to be that architects would start with these really dumb models with little sponges on toothpicks to represent trees and cardboard helping you make an argument. We're maybe more accustomed as people who work in publishing to prototypes and models that are end states. They're increasingly higher fidelity iterations of an end state. What this is saying is, we don't know what we want yet. So let's spend some time making these models and diagrams rhetorically, not to make a picture of an end state, but to represent an argument for, hey, if we did it like this. And then someone also have a different model say, oh, well, hey, if we did it like this. All of this before how. And toward this idea that the aim ultimately is not to make something that looks good, although it has to do that too, but to make something be good. Or in Richard's words, understanding precedes action. So that is what I have prepared for you, and if you would like, I have brought some posters. My company made a recreation. Richard wanted to understand the Olympics in 1984 when he lived in LA, and he didn't, so he wrote a book about the Olympics so that he could understand the Olympics. And we've recreated the diagrams he made to explain swimming. And if you would like one of those, I have a lot of them here, so please come see me if you'd like one. And thank you for your attention.